Welcome, everybody. I hope you can see me and hear me all right now. Thank you so much for coming to this event and participating in this panel. It's inspiring to see so many supporters joining us today. And I'm honored to be here as your moderator for Habitat for Humanity, Seattle King County's important discussion. I'm Lindsay Sheldon. I'm a morning anchor on Cairo 7, and I'll be hosting today's Women Build panel. The panel is a part of Women Build Week, which brings women from all walks of life together to address the housing crisis facing thousands of women and children in our region. Women Build Week helps fund critical projects, build homes, and revitalize neighborhoods, working side by side with Habitat's homeowners and volunteers. Habitat for Humanity is a global organization that advocates with governments around the world in support of housing affordability and access for all to have safe, decent, and affordable housing. Locally, Habitat Seattle King County brings people together as a community to build and create strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. I'm so excited to introduce you to our panel today. So let's get started. We first have Representative Mia Gregerson, State Representative, 33rd Legislative District of Washington. We also have Representative Jessica Bateman, the 22nd Legislative District, of course, of Washington State, and also State Senator Patty Cooter, the 48th Legislative District of Washington State. So I want to give a warm welcome to our panelists today. Thank you for sharing your time today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. If time allows, we hope to take questions directly from the audience later in the hour. So please just drop your comments there into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as we go along. Thank you all for joining us. So let's begin right now with the topic of empowering women through affordable home ownership. Today, we're here to talk about women and affordable housing. Women comprise about half of the workforce. However, they hold about 64% of the minimum wage jobs. Just think about that. Occupational segregation of women into lower paying jobs in domestic, healthcare, and hospitality jobs creates barriers to accessing affordable housing. Now, Habitat Seattle King County knows that homeownership can be transformational for women and families, which is why Habitat has been taking a lead on advocating for more affordable housing options here in Washington State. Today, we're going to hear more about affordable housing, zoning, land use, and the state budget. We'll also learn what happened during the recent 2022 legislative session and what we can all do to help get more affordable housing in our communities for women and families all across our state. Women in Washington are more at risk of being in or falling into poverty. The economic downturn associated with this recent pandemic made women and women of color even more vulnerable to financial instability. With higher rates of poverty, a persistent wage gap, and those continuing concerns about unemployment, the current crisis is shining a bright light on the underlying financial insecurity and housing instability of women in our communities. Our first topic is empowering women through affordable home ownership. Women are finding themselves on the front lines of this pandemic as it drags on, while also juggling careers, family obligations, and so much more. And as panelists, we all know that we juggled quite a bit even before the pandemic, and even more so now during this as it drags on. Each of you have prioritized affordable housing in your work. So can you broadly share some background on the recent housing items that you have championed during the last legislative session, particularly around exclusionary zoning and ADUs, accessory dwelling units? I wanted to start off first with Representative Bateman.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that introduction and orienting us to the mission of Habitat and the focus on women and homeownership. Happy to be here today. This past session, we all know that we're experiencing a housing shortage in Washington State, which is resulting in exponential increases in home prices and also more and more of our families' budgets going to their housing costs, including rent cost-burdened households, making them more vulnerable to fall into homelessness. So this past year, I worked with my colleague in the Senate, Senator Doss, to sponsor governor request legislation, House Bill 1782, that would have helped increase capacity for additional housing in Washington state by lifting and creating a floor of zoning across the entire state, like they've done in California and Oregon. Some people know, as maybe many on this call know, that the way that we allow for the construction of housing, who makes those decisions about what is allowed to be built and where, all occurs at the local city council level. And so since we have hundreds of cities in Washington state, all making these individual decisions, and we're collectively experiencing a shortage of over 250,000 homes statewide, and we have not been able to keep pace with our population growth, which is correlated to our job growth. It's really important, I think, for us to think about this from a state perspective, which is why Oregon and California have already legalized things like duplexes and fourplexes statewide. When we get into affordability, those fourplexes become much more affordable. Think of a single family home for $500,000. If you can divide that into 4, you're now seeing a home that could actually be affordable for the average family. So that bill unfortunately did not pass this past year, but it did create a really strong coalition, and we had a lot of dialogue. And so I'm hoping that we can bring that bill back next year. I'm sure more of your questions later will have be related to this, and I'll be happy to talk more. Thank you.
And Representative Bateman, could you provide some history around exclusionary zoning in particular, and how the history of redlining inform current zoning issues?
Yeah, so unfortunately, redlining is the manifestation of historical systemic racism in the United States, and it involves the U.S. government segregating neighborhoods based on race, and it also involves the Federal Housing Administration refusing to insure mortgages in and near African-American neighborhoods. Despite redlining being outlawed in the 60s, the impacts of redlining are still impacting communities today. And in fact, if you were to take a redlining map of Seattle and to overlay it today to their zoning map, you would see the segregation still exists to a great extent today. Not only that, but when those laws were outlawed, the segregation, what we saw was other zoning laws take their place, like increases in historical preservation zoning or single family residential zoning, which basically says you can only have single family homes in those areas, which most cities, most of their residential zoning is all for single family homes. We also saw the increase in homeowners associations. So this residential segregation produces negative socioeconomic outcomes for BIPOC communities. It limits access to quality education, access to healthcare, food, employment, and wealth building opportunities. So despite it being outlawed, we've seen as other practices take its place, and the legacy of redlining still impacting communities today. And in fact, in King County, Black homeownership is 29% versus white homeownership, which is 65%. Nationally, Black homeownership is lower today than it was when redlining was outlawed. So we still have a lot of work to do.
That is eye-opening and a stark gap. Thanks, Representative Bateman. Turning now to Representative Gregerson, could you talk a little bit about the recent housing items that you championed in the last legislative session?
Sure, thank you. And thank you to you and the organizers of this event today to really lift up the needs and talk about the issues related to women of color, in homeownership. It's something so important. So the real story is a few years ago when I was first elected to the legislature, the housing crisis was not something that was front and center in what we were talking about. And I met with someone from Sightline, and at the time I asked her, I said, what would be the one thing that would really make a difference in Washington state when it came to the housing crisis? And she said, hands down, statewide ADU policy. And that was a while ago. Fortunately, Sightline's been such a wonderful partner, AARP and others, in really ensuring that every year in Washington state, we come forward with a very progressive platform to talk about the best policies. And what we've learned is that while we know all the different barriers, such as high impact fees, restrictive parking, sewer capacity charges, things that are going to really make it difficult for local communities to really have more ADUs. What it's doing is it's teaching other states, it's teaching individual cities how they can take that on and really make change. What we've also learned is that if Washington State were able to actually pass legislation, we could build something like maybe 2,000 more units a year by just really having predictable, affordable ADUs all throughout our communities. Now, some people know them as like granny flats or basement apartments, backyard cottages. I live in a basement apartment. My mom lives upstairs. We know that by 2030, 1 in every 5 adults is going to be on a fixed income over 65 years old. And we really need to be thinking about this now. And so I'm really happy that we're talking about ADUs still. And I'm happy for those local elected leaders that talk quietly about how can they really champion this issue in their cities. And so I think things are changing. I'm excited to continue to talk about that. And until we start building smaller housing so that it's affordable to also upkeep, it's going to be more and more difficult for people, especially women of color, to have that sense of ownership.
And Representative Gregerson, you certainly make the case for why those ADUs are so important. Can you talk a little bit more about your work specifically on those and trying to increase those housing options?
Sure, and I spoke a little bit about some of the components of the legislation. House Bill 1337 unfortunately did not get out of policy committee. It did get a hearing, and it helped to support other pieces of legislation in the House. What you'll see is just ensuring that the codes are appropriate and statewide. The differences between the UGA and in and outside of the UGA, again, impact fees. We talked about parking restrictions and mandating parking. That's really a barrier for communities to be able to have ADUs being built. And of course, the financial institutions. At first, when we were starting this process, a lot of financial institutions just weren't used to funding and supporting folks who had a home and then wanting to make this change. I think those days are becoming more and more common, where people are moving forward and wanting to make those improvements to their home. And part of it is ensuring that we continue to talk about it. I think it's really easy to be scared that foreign people from outside your community are going to come in. The look of your community is going to be different, and now your property value is going down, and sort of some of that othering. And I think that the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it and show that, hey, this is what America is made of. Is really about being able to be innovative and be welcoming to all different parts of the community, to stay where they are and work close to where they live. And again, like me, I live in a multi-generational household. I was a single mother, and having aunties and uncles nearby to help raise my daughter was critically important. And I think that that's one of the things that we can do better. And this policy is one of those things I think that's going to help.
Thank you. And Senator Cooter, I know that you have been talking about ADUs. Could you talk a little bit more about the housing items that you championed in the most recent legislative session?
Sure. Thank you, Lindsay. It's really an honor to be here on the Women Build panel with Rep. Bateman and Rep. Gregerson, who are truly champions in the housing area. And I want to thank Habitat for sponsoring this really important discussion. You can't really talk about the lack of home ownership for our BIPOC community without talking about income inequality. Right now, white women make 78 cents on the dollar to their male counterparts, and you go all the way down to 54 cents on the dollar for Latina women. And I think that is something that equates to billions of dollars of lost economic opportunity for women. And I think that is something that we absolutely have to grapple with, along with making home ownership accessible for women in particular, and especially women who are parents in single family households. So what we've been doing, we looked at this issue when we regained control of the Senate, the Democrats in 2017. There was a push at that time to reorganize our committees and create a housing committee. That didn't happen that year because we were already in a biennium in 2018, so we kept the committee structure the same, but the very next year we created the housing committee, and I was honored to chair that. We did a deep dive into how did we get here? How did we get to this point where we don't have enough houses for the people who live in our state, and homelessness had really increased considerably. And that led us to an overall strategy that dealt with prevention, preventing people from falling into homelessness whenever possible to begin with, preservation of existing affordable housing, and then production of new opportunities for people. And we worked on several policies, especially dealing with prevention. That's what I was working on and focused on predominantly. And just this last session, I had a bill that extended the age of eligibility for the housing vouchers for our foster youth exiting the system, because we found that within a year of them leaving, a third of them became homeless. So this extends it through age 24. The idea is to give them a bridge and to allow them to get their feet under themselves and get off on the right foot in their lives. In terms of production, you heard from Rep. Bateman and Rep. Gregerson. Rep. Bateman's bill was a very robust ADU bill, and she very accurately and eloquently described the problem in terms of redlining and the need to have a missing middle policy for the state to create a floor where all the cities are kind of operating from the same starting point, and then giving some flexibility beyond that. One of the things that we ran into, of course, is a local control argument that was very strong, and it's very difficult to overcome that without having the political will, I guess, and we didn't have it this last year, unfortunately. We also had a bill by Representative Shoemake that was that had pieces and aspects of Representative Bateman's bill, but also did not make it over the finish line. The idea behind the ADU, as Rep. Gregerson pointed out, is to really leverage our existing infrastructure. So the house that's already there, to leverage the bottom unit and turn that into a mother-in-law apartment, or, the granny home, as she put it. I think that is a really smart thing to do, because it allows us to create more housing opportunities much more quickly. Because when you're talking about new housing developments, you're talking about laying all of that foundational structure, the infrastructure, the roads, the sewers, the electricity, the water, et cetera. That takes time, and that takes a lot of money. So I think it's really important for us to be able to leverage that existing infrastructure and to build smartly. It's not just putting a sixplex in the middle of a neighborhood that's 10 miles away from mass transit. It's a smarter approach than that. It's transit-oriented development. It's doing the high rises near the mass transit centers, the light rail stations, et cetera. And then when you have like a single bus stop, maybe a duplex, triplex in those areas. And there are lots in our districts that can easily accommodate that. Another one of the obstacles, though, Lindsay, has been owner occupancy of ADUs. That is a big issue. And some cities require the ADUs or one of the properties to be owner occupied for there to be an ADU. I've not found any data that is compelling that should be a requirement or a restriction. I'm looking for it to see if there's any validity to the concerns that I've heard expressed about why we need to have someone who owns the property physically on the property. But I'll give you an example of a conversation I had with an individual, a man who told me his father passed away and left him the home. The home was a very small house, but it was on a very big lot, and he wanted to put an ADU on there. He lived in Tennessee, and he didn't want to move to Seattle. He had a family, his children were small, they were growing up in Tennessee. Now, personally, I would have left in a heartbeat and come to Washington, but I understand you don't want to move the kids. And he was, in order to maintain ownership of that home, he would have had to live there. Now, that doesn't make sense, does it? He should have been able to rent that out, and he should have been able to create an ADU and create additional housing opportunities where it makes sense so that other families can move in and their kids can walk up to the school that was a few blocks away. So in short, I think we need to be looking at why these obstacles are there. Do they make sense? What is the history of them? Rep. Bateman talked a lot about the redlining. I think the history is really important to understand why those restrictions are in place, because then you can understand better if they're still needed in today's society. We want to create more home ownership opportunities, especially for our BIPOC community and especially for women. And that is something that my committee is going to be very focused on this next session as well.
Well, and Senator Cooter, as chair of the Senate Housing Committee, as you mentioned, you see all of these efforts, and thank you for highlighting some of these things that have made their way through. Looking at the efforts more broadly, could you talk about what these changes in policies right now mean for women and families in our communities right now who are struggling with affordable housing?
Well, I think what they mean is that there are going to be opportunities there for them. I mean, Habitat has been working very hard to create homeownership opportunities for our BIPOC community. We have the Housing Finance Commission that has a down payment rental assistance program that we've beefed up. We extended or expanded their debt limits so that they could build even more housing, bring more housing online. It is about creating opportunities for people. But as I said, especially for women and especially for women of color, we have to deal with the income inequality issue as well. Because we're not going to just build our way out of it without addressing the economic inequalities as well. Those, like I said, that's billions of dollars of lost economic opportunity for women. And it's just, it's wrong and it needs to change. And we've passed policies dealing with what employers can ask at, on an application, for example. And we're, had a bill, and forgive me that I don't remember if this one actually got over the finish line or not, but it was one dealing with requiring them to post the salaries ahead of time so that you could see they're valuing the job then and not waiting to see what the person looks like before they make an offer. And we also said that they could no longer ask what you made at your last job, because what we know is that women get paid less. And so if the job is worth X, they will pay X minus $20,000 to a woman. And we need that to stop. And we need employers to understand the importance of, of paying the value of the job and not defining that by, what the gender of the person or the race of the person. And thank you, Rep. Bateman did put in the chat the bill that we did pass on the salary transparency bill, 5761.
Thank you, Senator. Well, more than 60% of all Habitat homeowners are women head of households in the U.S. And we know that housing insecurity and affordability in the U.S. has been a challenge for women, especially for women of color. Nearly 1 in 3 single mothers lives below the poverty line, and 60% of impoverished children live in households headed by women. And so we're going to go back to you, Senator Cooter, because we want you to speak as much as possible in one chunk of time. We have a question for you about, in the spirit of Women Build Week, can you talk a little bit about your impact as a woman in leadership? What do you bring to the conversation that some other lawmakers maybe don't have when it comes to that lived experience?
Well, I have the lived experience of being a renter who had her roof fall in and had the landlord tell me that it was still habitable and they were going to put a tarp up and have me live there. I think in any other situation, if that had been a man, I do not think that would have been the reaction. But thankfully, I had a brother who had just graduated from law school, and he knew that I didn't have to live in that situation. I also think I bring to the table the experience of not being paid what I'm worth in a job. And having had that experience and knowing what it's like to assume more and more responsibilities in a job and then go out and hear that you're going to be bumped, and I kid you not, 10 cents an hour. This kind of thing has to stop. And I think having that perspective, having that, you know, having been worked all through college and law school and understand what it's like to pay the bills and understand what it's like to raise a family and know what stability means and know that the feeling of home is not just four walls and a roof over your head. It is a sense of security. It's a sense of belonging. It's foundational. It is a social determinant of health. And I think that as we look at creating more home ownership opportunities, we need to be looking at this holistically so that the opportunities are spread across our cities and our state. We don't want to, you know, create pockets here and there. I think, you know, I think the most vibrant community you can have is the one that is ethnically rich, educationally rich, and and economically rich. So you have those 3 E's, and if it's all diverse, you have people who live next to you who don't look like you, who may speak a different language, you know, who may make more money than you do. And I think that having that diversity all together in the same community makes us better community citizens overall. I think there's less of the otherizing. I think there's more trust that's created. I think you see community members caring about one another more. And I really feel that we can do that, but it takes resources, Lindsay. And I will say this about the state of Washington. You know, the last 4 years, I would say, we've really invested very heavily in housing. And I mean very heavily. We put in about $350 million into the Housing Trust Fund before this year, which we added another $114 million into the Housing Trust Fund, and that is to invest in and build more affordable housing. We also put in $240 million, almost a $250 million into the acquisition of buildings that can be retrofitted into housing opportunities. And also to help transition people from off the streets and into permanent housing. So we have made some major investments. So we also invested into preventing people from falling into homelessness with the emergency rental assistance money that we created in the permanent fund there. But we have to understand we're all in this together, and that it will take all of us working collaboratively and cooperating to build the inventory that we need in order that every Washingtonian has that safe and secure home that they deserve.
Thank you for highlighting some of those major root issues that lead to housing insecurity, Senator, and also highlighting some of the assistance programs there. Representative Gregerson, you talked about it a little earlier, about your experiences as a woman and mother. When we're talking about housing and how critical it is for everybody, it's so important for families, it's so important for children. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences as a woman and a mother and how that's informed your decision making and how it plays into the policy decisions that you make daily as a legislator?
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, you know, I was tagged as the accidental politician. I really come from a very blue collar family. I was adopted. My orphan name is behind me on this, on my background there. And it just reminds me of really someone who comes from nothing, but has a family, a strong family network, who helped me go through public school. I was someone who came back to live with my family so I could get my degree at a time when there were public resources, whether it was WIC, whether it was food stamps, financial aid. And my father was a veteran who used benefits to get his degree from the University of Washington. And so my family here in the shadow of the airport in SeaTac is your perfect example of people who are just working hard and trying to give back to their community. And now I'm in a position of power and really taking that experience with me to not forget what it means to live with dignity. Oftentimes you see a correlation between people, low-income people of color, and being trustworthy. And it's really not a fair narrative. And so with me, when I'm working on the budget now. I know Senator Kruder talked a little bit about the budget. It was these are some historic numbers. We invested almost $2 billion in housing and homelessness, in some of the line items that the senator mentioned, but also on stipends and helping workers stay in the positions that we need them to because they're doing essential work. It's also about helping women flee from domestic violence situations, which we know that there's a correlation to homelessness there. We have over 1 million children in our K-12 system, and 600,000 of them really are food insecure. We need to make sure that we're providing universal meals to them. And so all these decisions that I'm making in this over 1,000-page document, I take that lens with me and really try to, on my caucus, our caucus really prioritizes racial equity. We prioritize climate change, and we want to make sure there's economic priorities in helping people recover, because women of color are not recovering evenly. And with the equity lens, we're really moving a lot of dollars towards trusted messengers, people in our communities who have those relationships and are able to help them navigate all these systems that you'll hear my colleagues continue to talk about, because you have to prove you're either low income enough or able, and before a lot of public dollars can go your way. There's usually covenants that go with that or restrictions, and then there can be a real chill effect. And so I think there's an opportunity here to modernize some of our systems and use ways of universal onboarding so people can feel prideful in what they're receiving and also be able to turn and give back. So that's the investment in human capital that I feel like I received. And I'm hoping that this is a way to continue to pass that forward.
Thank you for sharing those parts of your personal story and how it's impacted the important work that you're doing. Thank you, Representative Ferguson. Moving to Representative Bateman, you mentioned the importance of local work, the local zoning, and how that impacts the work that you're trying to do at the state level. And you come to this work as a former Olympia City Council member. So how has your life experience and the work that you've engaged with informed your priorities around housing and the work you do now?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I am my mother's daughter, and my mom grew up in a trailer park in rural Montana, raised me as a single mom, started her career out as a janitor at a wastewater treatment plant. Thanks to affirmative action, she was able to get that job in a predominantly male field. That source of income and that union position gave her health benefits and enabled her to buy a first home for, gosh, I think $117,000 back in the day in Maple Valley. So I know how important it is to see the byproduct of these systems and supports and that intergenerational wealth building opportunity. I was able to get help with my first home because of the wealth opportunity that my mom had, in large part to some policies and some opportunities that she got. I also experienced being unhoused as a youth. There were some challenges at home. My mom had some intergenerational trauma as well as poverty. And so in addition to being unhoused and being able to relate to folks not having stable housing, I also worked in the hospitality sector while I was going through school. I went to community college and then went on to Evergreen State College. The height of the recession, I was on unemployment. I got on food stamps because I couldn't afford my living expenses because the impact of the economy was so bad. So I can relate to what Senator Kruder pointed out, which is that housing is a social determinant of health. My work on the city council really focused on, I was elected in 2015, and the biggest issue that voters were talking about was homelessness. So I immediately started getting to work on learning as much as I could about that issue. And like Senator Kruder and Representative Gregerson mentioned, when you look at the symptoms of not having enough housing, homelessness, being cost burdened, that intergenerational gap with housing opportunity, you see that these are symptoms of not having enough housing. So I started working on zoning there. We passed our own zoning, the missing middle ordinance. But my experience taught me that it takes a really long time to get those changes through at the local level. It took us 3 years to pass an ordinance that would create about 1,000 homes over 20 years if every person were to take advantage of the zoning change, and we need 13,000 homes over 20 years. So 1/13, and it took us 3 years. My biggest takeaway and my message to you all today would be, we have to address this issue with a sense of urgency for all of the reasons that you indicated, but also because we can pass a law tomorrow that makes the zoning change. It will take 3 years before someone gets to move in. And we are seeing 15, 20% year-over-year increases in home prices. It is unsustainable. It will not change. It will get worse. And more people will become homeless when they get $600 rent increases, which I just talked to a constituent in my district. Her daughter's a single mom teacher in Spokane. She just got a notice of a $600 rent increase, which she cannot afford. We do not have enough resources to house the currently unhoused today, and we definitely don't have enough resources for a tsunami of people that become unhoused because we don't have enough housing. So my own personal experience leads me to empathize with people going through the struggle of housing. My career experience as an elected local official really reinforces the sense of urgency that we need to take as leaders to address this issue holistically. And we've got really great foundation, the work that the Housing and Local Government Committee in the Senate has taken. And we can get this done. It's a solvable problem. We need to work on it together, prioritize, and be really efficient, and we can address this issue.
That rent increase you mentioned is stunning. Wow. Thank you, Representative Bateman, for sharing the life experiences that ground and guide the work that you're doing right now. Want to move on to our topic of road to recovery. And all three of you have touched on it. Housing affordability has been decreasing in this country, both for homeowners and for renters since the 1970s. But that's accelerated since 2000, with housing costs increasing a lot faster than incomes. In 2019, before COVID-19, 37 million households were paying more than 30% of their income on rental mortgages. And among renters, it was about half. We know those burdens are higher among households of color. And for today's conversation, the National Equity Atlas has estimated that Black and Latinx women renters have the highest burden across all households. Nationally, communities of color were amongst the most vulnerable groups of our population long before this pandemic hit, with African Americans and Hispanics accounting for 21% and 17% of COVID cases, respectively. Decades-long barriers such as inadequate access to healthcare, higher incidence of pre-existing health conditions, and housing disparities have contributed to a higher risk of death from infections. Question for all three of you: what steps should we be taking to rectify this disparity for housing accessibility, especially for vulnerable groups? Representative Bateman, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, production of housing will help everyone. That we need to close that gap of the 250,000 homes that we are short in Washington State, especially allowing for the construction and development of housing that is more affordable for families, like 4plexes and 6plexes. In addition to that, some policies that we have made, like increasing the amount that the Housing Finance Commission can loan to give them more access to loan that out. We also have first-time homeownership opportunity programs. It's really, it's so multifaceted. We need to close that wage gap. We need to make sure that we're providing outreach and assistance to folks so they know what programs currently exist. It's about preservation of existing homes. It's about ensuring that once people do get into homes, that they can stay in those homes. It's also about ensuring that there are because even if we can get people into homes, which is great, for low income, low wage workers, for women of color, there's a whole bunch of other social determinants of health that we need to address, and we need to make sure. So access to healthcare, doing things like passing our Diaper Need Act, our diaper subsidy, which was a really great benefit that we added for families, funding the Working Families Tax Credit, making sure that people have access to recreation opportunities in neighborhoods. That's another element of allowing middle housing all across the state, because some of the neighborhoods that have the best amenities, the most opportunity, those are the ones that are the most segregated. Those things like having ample access to parks, clean air, clean water, also have a positive impact on health. So there's so many things that are related. I also just want to highlight, because in the Housing and Human Services and Veteran Affairs Committee, which is our version in the House, we had a really fantastic presentation by it's about increasing Black homeownership in the Puget Sound region by the Black Homeownership Initiative. I'll put it in the chat. They've done a lot of work to create a 7-point plan, including sustaining existing owners, marketing and outreach, pre-post purchase counseling, purchase supports and tools, credit and lending, housing production, which they strongly emphasize, and policies and practices. So they've done the work, and I think it's really our job to implement those recommendations.
Yeah, we all know how devastating healthcare costs can be for families that are trying to secure housing or to stay in housing. Thank you, Representative Bateman. Turning now to Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's hard to follow Rep. Bateman's answer. She had such a thorough, well thought out answer. So I'll try to add a little bit to that, in that I think that one of the things that we're seeing as a state, right, we have the most regressive tax system, which means that people that are earning less than $100,000 are paying, nearly 17% of their wages towards taxes. So when we hear we hear about rhetoric about paying too much taxes, I think we all believe that. It's about having targeted investments and growing the economy where it needs to grow. I was recently at a fiscal seminar and listened to Wells Fargo speak to us about states and what states should and should not do, especially with all the federal funding that has come into our states. And the one thing he said was, make sure you don't just give blanket tax breaks. Blanket tax cuts do nothing but push the money just all over, rather than really growing the economy. Invest where you want to grow the economy. And I think the conversation today is that's the lens that we have to use when we're passing budgets, when we're looking at policy, when we're investing in partnerships, when we're asking our local governments to be held accountable and how they serving their communities, when we're talking about interpretation and do we have a shared comprehensive language so that we're all talking about the same thing. In low-income communities, we also recognize that the voices are not at the table, whether it's your local PTA. I recently had a very large mobile home park that was closing. I have another one closing. There are about 1,100 mobile home parks around the state, and there's already triple digits of numbers of mobile home parks closing. Where are they going to go? They literally mostly are going to walk away from their home that they own, they've invested, and they are multiple generations passed down in those homes, and they take care of one another. We need to find out how to get ahead of that, to support that community before the home closes, rather than after it's closing and then trying to scramble and find a place for them. So those are some of the efforts I know that we have going. I know that we're going to be continuing to talk about our tax system and making it more fair. But until we do those structural things, we'll be in this either or message infrastructure. And that's one of the most structurally racist things that we could do, is not work in a place of abundance, but to think about who's going to be the winners and losers. And unfortunately, the political will make it very, very difficult for these people that we're talking about today to be front and center and to get the resources that they need and deserve. Thanks.
And Representative Gregerson, why are those mobile home parks closing? Are the owners of them simply just selling off the land?
Well, you hear about the squeeze, right? My colleagues have talked about land prices, whether there's not enough places to either build or you could build higher, more better use. I live in the city of SeaTac. Not many cities have 3 light rail stations. What happens is there's lots of funds to build infrastructure so you can get through my community, but not necessarily stay. So what happens is you have people or entities that own property in your community. It's a great investment. You might buy it for $3 million. The light rail station now opens, and now it's worth $10 million. But the people on that property, of course, they're not necessarily, while they're paying the taxes on that property, the value of that property could go up. It could be worth more. And so that's the struggle we have. We used to talk a lot about displacement. We actually don't really talk about that anymore because we're trying so hard to actually just build housing. But displacement is a real problem also. And so I think that's why you see this push-pull now that the moratorium has been ended from the pandemic, and the ability now to turn those properties is a great business model for some.
Thank you, Representative Ferguson. And turning now to Senator Kudlow and talking about the steps that we should be taking to rectify these disparities for housing accessibility.
Well, I think my colleagues really covered a lot of it. I will say that, you know, we have in our Constitution something called the Uniformity Clause that requires all property be taxed at a uniform rate. And that has been an issue in the sense that we are seeing foreign investment into our state. In one of my cities, I remember specifically walking into a neighborhood and having one of the neighbors tell me that all 3 homes around him were ghost homes. These are people from out of state, venture capitalist companies, or out of the country who are buying up homes and letting them sit vacant. And this is a problem when we have so many people who need to have a home. Our uniformity clause prevents us from taxing empty homes at a higher rate, unlike Vancouver, BC is able to do that. And that is how they've been addressing that issue. It's been happening all over, not just here in Washington. The same with the mobile home parks that Representative Gregerson was talking about. We're seeing venture capitalists buy them up and either jack up the rents because when you own the home, but you don't own the land that it sits on. And so the rent that you pay for that land has been skyrocketing. And she's absolutely right. This was one of our most affordable options especially for our senior citizens. I have 2 in my district. One is owned by the King County Housing Authority. That's not going anywhere. The other one is filled with, you know, there's probably 50 units of extremely low income families there. And if they have to move, they will have to move at least 100 miles away from their family, from their friends, from their communities, from their schools. And we have to find a better way of dealing with that. So that's one of the problems is our, in addition to the ones that the representatives talked about, is our uniformity clause. I think that needs to be looked at. But one of the answers, I think, and again, housing is not just one solution. We need a lot of policies working collaboratively together, and we need to target it. Because as you pointed out, Lindsay, we're really missing housing opportunities for our BIPOC community members and for our low-income and working families, quite frankly. And I think that community land trust is a potential opportunity for us. This is where a nonprofit corporation would hold the land, and we would be able to, and the people would be able to live there in a community, and they would be able to control the cost of their home. I think that's a really smart approach, and we are looking at more ways of expanding the use of that. I know the Habitat model of keeping home ownership affordable in perpetuity is something I'd like to see replicated across the state as well. I think it's an excellent approach. There is a rub between for-profit developers and nonprofit developers who can build the housing for the less amount of money, what's the best bang for the buck. But I think in the end, what we need to be looking at is what is truly affordable. There are programs at the federal level, like the LIHTC program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, that is a tax credit for 15 years. And it's an investment tool to get private developers involved in financing and developing affordable housing. And at the end of the 15 years, the title is supposed to transfer to a nonprofit that will operate the development and keep it affordable. That's the goal. But what we are hearing is that in some instances that the private developers are actually suing the nonprofits to prevent transfer of the title after 15 years. So there's some, there are some things that we need to do to tighten up programs like that to make sure that they do what we want them to do, and that they are truly providing the affordable housing that we know we need. and also making sure that the taxpayer dollars that we're using are being used to their highest and best use. So, we are committed to all common sense, reasonable ideas in order to increase our housing. Rep. Bateman is right. We need to create about 250,000 more units. That's not going to happen overnight. So we do have to think about other options, not just building single family homes, but also, there are tiny homes and, there are other things that we can be doing in order to quickly build housing. And that is really the crux of it, is the timing. The need is now, and it's also tied into our resources. And so we are committed at the state legislature to creating those opportunities, the homeownership opportunities. And you're going to see more policy coming out next year. And I really hope, Rep. Bateman, that her bill is back, and we have another opportunity to debate that in full and hopefully get that over the finish line.
You talked about that urgency that was mentioned before. And following up, a question for all three of you. Thinking about legislation more locally, how can we collectively make a strong case to support the acceleration of affordable housing for low-income families all around our region? Senator Fedora.
I think you just have to remember what you said about how many families are cost burdened in right now in their housing, and this is not sustainable. It is the property values accelerating the way they are. We don't control that. That's not sustainable, and we are not going to be able to build fast enough to get ourselves out of this. We have to be looking at the entire spectrum of prevention, preservation, remodel when we can. Like I said, we did put $250 million into rapid acquisition of existing buildings, and that can be a huge opportunity for local governments in particular to renovate and to make sure that we have, that we're bringing more housing online as quickly as possible. There are also, companies that make prefab homes, 3D homes that can be put up very, very quickly. And so I think we need to be looking at all options here in terms of being able to build as quickly as we can, but we also have to preserve what we have and not lose it. And we also have to prevent people from falling into homelessness wherever we can. And again, I go back to the fact that this isn't just a housing issue. This is also an economic inequality issue. When we were talking about housing being a social determinant of health, that's also true about your neighborhood where you live, which is why we passed the HEAL Act dealing with transportation, and where, those dollars have to go to clean up certain neighborhoods where our transportation system has maybe raised the level of pollutants that cause people health issues in those neighborhoods. And I think that is a really important piece of this. The House and the Senate are in alignment in looking at our policies through an equity lens. And we want to make sure that Washington is a great place to live for everyone. It's a welcoming place for everyone. And so that's our overall goal, and our policies are going to be designed to match that.
Thank you, Senator. And Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Lindsay. I second everything that the senator said. Just to keep adding to the conversation, I think there's really a lot of great information that can help people wherever they are humanize what we're dealing with, whether it's humanizing what visual poverty means or what intergenerational poverty means and our commitment to end that. We have 8 great strategies that everything we do has a touchback, and mostly it centers women and children. We know that the workforce has not recovered for women, especially ages 24 to 54. That's basically me. And I've already found that I am helping to be a caretaker at home as my family ages. We need to make sure that the childcare system is up and running and robust as people go back to work. That means also providing adequate wages for childcare workers and appropriate things that they need to run a small business. I think that we live in overburdened communities, and there's ways, as Senator Cooter talked about, to target investment so that women and children are living in healthier environments. Our children are our future, so investing in human capital, period, will make for a better society. It'll make for better employees, and it'll make for healthier small businesses. We have some of the best educational systems here with the University of Washington and others. There's no reason why we can't make it a more affordable. We have a growing apprenticeships. So we have so much opportunity for people. We just need to do better. And I think when you don't even notice government, that's when we're doing the best. I find that no pain, no process, and people are just going on their day and doing what they need to. And so really it's that wraparound. It's that all of us have a place in this, and some can lead while us in government can be wonky on policy and do some of the stuff in the background. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, everything is connected. That is for certain. And returning now to Representative Bateman.
Yeah, I'll just close with the fact that our housing shortage, which is creating our subsequent housing crisis with these exponential increases in home prices, is locking families and communities out of opportunity, and it's impacting women and women of color the most. And it will continue unless we close that shortage. And we will not do that without addressing middle housing and increasing our capacity. So while we can do things like preserving and preventing people, we won't be able to close that gap unless we legalize middle housing. It is a factual impossibility. It also happens to be much harder for our legislative colleagues to get behind. It's easier to do things like fund homelessness or fund preservation because of the discussion around local control. So we are dealing with a mathematical equation. We have solutions that are at our disposal. We have models like the state of California and Oregon that have passed this legislation. And the reason why I mention this is because once we do that, once we open up the capacity, then we have to do about 10 more things. And I know Habitat is intimately familiar with all of the other things that we have to do to address actually creating and constructing that housing. But we have to do it because if we don't, more and more families will be continually locked out of communities, struggling to get by and falling into homelessness.
And as we are wrapping up here, what would each of you identify as the single most important point that you would make about women, recovery, and housing for the coming year, and how we all need to work together in these recovery efforts? Representative Bateman.
We have an urgent problem that we can fix. We know how to do it. And I would just say that we need to convey the story of our housing shortage and crisis in a way that people can relate to, talk about it from a human perspective, tell the story of families to really motivate and make it easier for our legislative colleagues to say yes.
And Representative Gregerson.
I would add that we need to get cash in people's pockets. Higher wages, low-income people need cash to be able to put back into the community to pay for their rent, take care of their children. We heard in Taiwan that when families are able to take care of themselves, it relieves the government. So really raising the wages of women of color doing hard work.
And Senator Cooter.
We need to invest more resources in housing opportunities, and we have been doing that, but we need to do more. And I'd like to see, we have put a spotlight on it in the Senate and the House by forming committees around housing, but I think at the state level that we need to have a separate agency dealing with housing. It's that urgent.
You're not a lot that urgency. Thank you, all three of you, for sharing the important work that you're doing. Your insights, your perspective on this topic. It's clear we're finding our way to the new normal. And it's also great to hear about how businesses, how communities, and individuals can help. So we thank you again for sharing your time and the work that you're doing. We do have a few minutes to take questions. So I'm going to ask Ryan Donahue, Habitat's Policy and Advocacy Director, to take a question or two from the audience. So Ryan, I'm going to
We're actually going to have to go ahead and close out, I think, Lindsay. Thank you very much, though.
Everyone said so many great things, so I think we've probably covered a lot of the questions that people might have had. So thank you so much, and again, we've all really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our audience has as well. Thank you again to our panelists for serving on this panel. your willingness to share your time, your life experiences, your perspective, your passion is so evident, your expertise have been critical to the success of this event. And I also want to thank you for supporting the 2022 Women Build Week and Habitat for Humanity, Seattle, King County. Habitat can't do this vital work without your investment of time or financial support. For all of you, thank you. Thank you so much. Find out how you can get involved and learn more at www.habitatskc.org. There's still time to volunteer for Women Build Week, so you can sign up, you can get involved. There's plenty to do. Thanks again for your time today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Lindsay. Bye, everyone.